I would like to focus my presentation, just a very brief presentation of what is the organization where I work, and the reason we were invited is because there was a lot of discussion this morning about clinical trials and access to clinical trials. I have to say this organization does not work in clinical trials, commercial clinical trials. It's mostly academic trials, so what we call investigator-initiated clinical trials or studies. How we work in Europe and how we support also multinational clinical trials for rare diseases. I will talk about what are specificities of multinational clinical trials for rare diseases, what are the challenges to set up a trial on rare diseases, and what are also the opportunities, because we work a lot in European projects funded with the European Commission funds, and there are also many opportunities to try to fill up the gap on these challenges for setting up trials for rare diseases. And then to finalize, I would like to talk to you about an initiative that I think it has been running just for a year. It's called EUXCT, and it's an initiative dedicated to discuss cross-border access to clinical trials. I didn't know we had an example, but this morning Professor Wind and Professor Unap, they already showed the example of cross-border access in a clinical trial. So then if we can discuss how this was made possible, that would be great too. ECRIN, as I said, it stands for European Clinical Research Infrastructure Network. Our mission is supporting the conduct of multinational clinical studies in Europe. We work mostly with academia, with investigator-initiated clinical studies. This is a distributed organization. This means that we have a core team that is working in Paris. This is where I work. And then we have a connection with networks of clinical trial units. These clinical trial units are able to provide all the services to the sponsor and the investigator to set up the clinical trial in the different countries. There are 13 countries that belong to the organization now. These networks of clinical trial units, they are publicly funded. So it's usually Ministry of Health, Ministry of Research who funds the clinical trial units and also who contributes to ECRIN to coordinate the work of all these clinical trial units to set up multinational studies. Altogether, they make more than 120 clinical trial units to support the setup of the trials. This is the map of ECRIN. Unfortunately, I could not update it because the one that appears in yellow, that is Slovakia, appeared as an observer country, but it has become member. So we have now 13 full member countries. Estonia is not yet part of the organization, but hopefully, I don't know if the Ministry of Health is still here. It's a good message because it gives the opportunity also to make grow also the community of clinical trial units in the country and participate in multinational trials. How does it work? Well, when we are contacted by investigators or by sponsors, we discuss with them, we provide general information about how they can work with ECRIN. We usually support clinical trials that have more than 3 countries, in which at least 2 countries belong to the organization, because this is publicly funded by the countries that belong to the organization. And then we help them also to find funding sources, because as I said, most of the studies we are involved are publicly funded. And there are calls for funding clinical studies at national level, but there are not so many opportunities when we go to the multinational component. And then in the planning, so we give advice on the clinical trial design and methodology, also to understand what are the regulatory and the ethical conditions to get the authorizations for the trial. Funding, many times we are partner of a consortium that is asking for funding, usually is funding from the European Commission. And then if the trial is funded, we, through our national partners, through the clinical trial units in the different countries, we provide the services. Services necessary for clinical trials are study management and coordination, regulatory and ethical submission. All the trials need to get authorization from the national competent authorities and also for the ethics committees in all the countries. Monitoring. All the clinical trials have to be monitored for safety, etc., with the patients, data management, and also a statistical analysis. These services are given through the clinical trial units that belong to the network. And this is the portfolio of ECRIN in 2023. As you can see here, in yellow is the countries where the investigator that initiated the trial or the sponsor. Sponsors are usually universities where the investigator is located. This is the entity that acts as a sponsor, and the sponsor is the principal investigator. In yellow is the coordinator, so meaning that the coordinator of the whole trial is located mostly in Germany, France, and Spain, probably due to the fact that these countries are usually more successful in asking for funding to the Commission. So, but in principle, these calls for funding are open to everyone, but it seems that these countries are a little bit more successful on getting funding, and that's why many times they are coordinators of the trial. But then what you can see is that then many other countries are involved in the trial, even though the coordination is mostly limited to these 3 countries. Estonia, I have highlighted Estonia because I was looking there was a study in Estonia. Yes, there was one. This one is not on rare diseases, but it was a phase 3 trial coordinated by Utrecht University in Netherlands, 9 participating countries, and here in Estonia it was University of Tartu. And then the average number of countries that we have in our studies is between 4 and 5. There were a few exceptions here in which there were more than 10 countries involved. Those were clinical trials on COVID-19 during the pandemic. There were many clinical trials led by academia because they were for repurposing drugs, something that usually is not of interest for industry. And in those trials, we had participation of many countries because it was a pandemic. And then here, what I just wanted to show 2 examples of trials that ECRIN has supported in pediatrics or in the field of rare diseases, just for you to see the type of trials that we are involved in. What you see here is the first one is in neonates or infants for Prader-Willi syndrome, but it was oxytocin. Oxytocin is already a drug that is in the market, so we don't work so much in new drugs, but we work, investigator-initiated trials are usually repurposing drugs that are already in the market and can be used for a different disease. This is repurposing, or the second one that is actually not even a drug, it's a treatment, it's the comparison of two procedures. And this is something also that commercial sponsors are never going to invest in comparing two different procedures. In this case, is endoscopic versus laparoscopic myotomy, also for idiopathic achalasia. So this is the type of trials that the ECRIN is supporting. We are also involved in other services and activities. Here, this is a program, it's called the Data Center Certification Program. By this program, what ECRIN does is providing a certificate, making audits to clinical trial units to give them kind of like to test the ability that they have to provide compliant, effective, and efficient data management services for clinical trials. It's not so easy to get a good academic clinical trial unit to give this service on data management. And many times when academic trials are inspected, there are always complaints about the quality of the data. So it was important for us and to have something in Europe that would be of enough quality to run multinational academic trials. And this is the program that was set up several years ago by ECRIN. We have 35 now, 11 clinical trial units in different countries in Europe. And then other activities we are involved is, for instance, the organization of the ECRIN Clinical Trials Unit Day. So we bring together all the more than 120 clinical trial units to discuss topics that are of interest for all the CTUs in all the countries. We also organize specific scientific meetings that are open to the ECRIN community. Online training, most of the cases is open to everyone, usually is posted in our website. And also we organize every year around the 15th of May is the International Clinical Trials Day. It's in a different country every year. This year it's in Madrid and it's about the inclusivity of patients in clinical trials. I invite everyone, it's free, both online and on-site. Both are free. I invite you to go to Madrid, it's my hometown too, so beautiful town. If you want to visit, it's a good opportunity. And then we are also involved in these other projects that we call infrastructure development projects or capacity projects. These projects are not purely clinical trials, so we support purely a clinical trial, but also these projects that are funded many times by the European Commission just to develop in general the capacity in Europe to run for clinical research in general, and if they are more related to clinical trials, we usually try to be there. Some examples are promoting data sharing and reuse, very important for rare diseases, collaborating with other infrastructures, collaborating with other actors in clinical research, etc. And these are the outputs of these projects. I will give some examples. As an output of the project, there are tools and services, training and education, and also guidelines and recommendations. These are some of the projects that we have been involved with, these ones that I call infrastructure development that are related to rare diseases and also to pediatrics. On rare diseases, we were involved in the European Joint Programme for Rare Diseases. This was a very big project that lasted 6 years. It's co-funded by the European Commission and national funders. I don't know if Estonia was involved in EJPRD. I think so. No, it wasn't, but it is in ERDERA. Yeah. Yes. So this project was working in two different lines. So it was, on one side was launching calls for funding. So there was funding for the research, rare diseases community, mostly on preclinical studies, not so much in clinical trials, and also in developing in general, in supporting researchers, rare diseases researchers. The project finishes last year, and this year, no, it was the end of last year, around September, started the continuation of EJP, that is this one that is called ERDERA. Professor Unav said that Estonia is now part of this ERDERA, and this probably involves the funder of clinical research in Estonia, because this type of partnerships, as I said, bring together European Commission plus funders in the different countries. So it means that the rare diseases community in Estonia will have possibility to look for funding or to apply for funding through this program. The INVENTS project was also funded recently, I think like 1 year ago, and this one is working on methodology for clinical trials on rare diseases. This is important, I will go back to this point. Setting up clinical trials on rare diseases is challenging because there are very few patients. As we have been discussing this morning, that patients even have to move to another country to get the treatment, etc. So all the methodology that has been developed classically for clinical trials is based on a minimum number of patients that have to be recruited to get enough power, etc. And this is challenging for rare diseases. That's why it was important also to fund projects like this, like INVENTS, working on developing new methodology that is more specific for rare diseases. And then we have been involved also in this Moonshot initiative, that is, it brings together mostly industry and academic partners to discuss how public-private partnership can work together to accelerate research on rare diseases. And then on the other hand, for pediatrics, and I speak about pediatrics because you have seen this morning that most of these rare diseases affect mostly children. ECRIN was coordinator of a project in the past called PetCRIN that was also working on how to make more easier or more feasible running clinical trials on pediatrics in Europe. The project has already finalized, but there are some outcomes that are still valid from this project. And then this other project, Connect for Children, it was a partnership public, industry and academic partners, and it was also aiming to develop capacity to run clinical trials from pediatrics in Europe. Some examples of the tools that we have developed through these projects are here. The first one is a regulatory and ethical database. This, I will go back to this point again later, but it's due to the fact that in many cases, the regulations that are applicable to clinical trials are not harmonized in Europe. Many cases you want to make a multinational clinical trials and you have to understand what is the regulation applicable in Estonia, in Italy, in Spain, etc. And this is not easy, especially for academic sponsors. The second one is what we call the Rare Diseases Clinical Trial Toolbox. I will give an example of some of the tools that are here. And the third one, it was developed through the PetCRIN project that I mentioned before, that are pediatric tools for the setup of management of multinational neonatal and pediatric trials in Europe. Those are all available through the ECRIN website. And then focusing in this one, in the Rare Disease Clinical Trial Toolbox, this one was developed through the European Joint Programme for Rare Diseases that just finalized, and is a way we wanted to make tools that have been developed in other projects discoverable, because a problem that we have also with the many projects that are funded by the European Commission is that many times the outputs are unknown for the whole community. And we said, okay, the Commission has been many years funding already projects to try to boost research on rare diseases, but this many times the community doesn't know about that, etc. How can we make it more better known? So what we did, it was defining 18 specific activities that are very important to consider when an investigator is setting up a clinical trial, from the moment in which they have the original idea to the time in which results have to be published and disseminated, all the steps in between. And we said, okay, what has been developed by others that is free, that is public, that can be used and reused in the different steps of a clinical trial. And I wanted to give an example here as a study case. We say, okay, investigator that wants to set up a clinical trial on a rare disease, pediatric, and also they want to incorporate genetic analysis from some samples collected during the clinical trial. And we say, okay, there are, for instance, the European Network of Pediatric Research at the European Medicines Agency. They have developed 2 guides. The first guideline, the one that it says here 2015, but this one has been updated, I think 1 or 2 years ago. This one is a very interesting document because it lists per country what are the specificities when an investigator wants to set up a clinical trial for children. Informed consent has to be collected by mother or father just in one country, and in one country is accepted just the mother or the father, etc. And this is different per country. So it's important when you are an investigator setting up a multinational component, understand what are the specificities per country. This document has this information. Or the other guidance that they have developed is specific topics that have to be covered in an informed consent to include a child in a clinical trial. What has to be included in the informed consent to be accepted by the ethics committee to run the trial. This is another document that was drafted by Emprema. And then a completely different project, that is the project ECRIN, that is the International Consortium to work also on research on rare diseases, have developed this other one that includes specific clauses that you would have to include in the informed consent to be able to collect data, genetic data, for further analysis. So this is just an example of some of the tools that include this toolkit. And then just going why it's difficult to set up clinical trials on rare diseases, and also what are the opportunities that are available. Well, setting up multinational clinical trials on rare diseases is challenges, and there are challenges that are linked to the left, and because, as I said, we work in academic trials, I put challenges that are linked to any clinical trial led by academia. And then specific challenges to clinical trials for rare diseases that are actually common to academic and non-academic trials, commercial trials too. In the left, all non-industry sponsored trials have to deal with the non-harmonization on the legal and ethical framework. As I said, there have been several regulations accepted in the last year that are trying to harmonize the way clinical trials are run in Europe, that there are still some exceptions that go through the national laws. So this is complicated for academic sponsors. Then funding sources. As I said, there are many ministries of research, ministries of health. They launch calls for funding research, but many times it's only limited at national level, so we cannot go for the multinational component. So understanding where the money is, and also how to use the money, because this is another complexity. We are now used to it, but getting funding from the European Commission requires also a lot of knowledge on how then you have to report how the money was spent, etc. And this is not easy at all. And then about the sponsorship, when the industry sponsors trials, the sponsor is a commercial company, a pharmaceutical company, and the investigator is a clinician, etc. In these trials, academic trials, is usually as I said, university or the entity that hires or that hosts the principal investigator is the sponsor, and many times they are not so much aware of what are the responsibilities of a sponsor, and there are many responsibilities as a sponsor of a clinical trial. So this is also a complexity. And then if we go to the specific challenges that are linked to the rare diseases, the first one, the most obvious one, is the fact that there are not so many patients. There are Maybe in one single country we cannot run the trial because there is only one child. So it's important to go for the multinational component, but then to finding the right patients to participate in the trial. The second one is understanding the natural history of the disease. Because if we don't know how the disease progresses, then it's very difficult to design a good study. This is another complexity, and many times they are very heterogeneous, so it's very difficult to run this natural history study. These studies are studies in which there is no intervention, you just follow the patient through the time, and then you know how the disease progressed to make then a good design in the clinical trial. Then the need of novel trial designs that are adapted to these two things that we said before, the fact that there are not many patients and also the fact that the population is very heterogeneous. We were talking, I think, in a talk before this morning, somebody talked about the different types of cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis was the example, with different manifestations, etc. This is very heterogeneous, and this is also complicated to design good clinical trials. And then also the need for more sensitive outcome measures to quantify the disease. Many times they are the main outcome that is being measured by the clinical trial is not the most meaningful for the patient. So this is also something that is challenging. And just to go into the interest from the scientific community to set up clinical trials for rare diseases, this is a survey that was made by the European Joint Programme for Rare Diseases within European reference networks. Probably you are aware of this. These European reference networks are networks of reference centers for treating patients on rare diseases. I don't know if, is there any here? Yeah, your center probably is ERN. Exactly. So through this program, researchers that were linked to these European reference networks, they were asked what among different services were more important when they were developing research for rare diseases. And they say that getting support to conduct clinical trials was very important. And then even more, when they were asked, when they were setting up a clinical trials, what between the different areas was most relevant for them, they were signaling the fact that the regulatory and ethical framework is not easy to understand, especially when they go to the multinational component. So there is a need to support investigators to set up trials. And indeed, just going to this point about the regulatory and ethical framework, as I explained before, since the last 10 years, several regulations have been approved in Europe. The most important one is the clinical trial regulation that has harmonized now the way clinical trials for medicinal products are done in Europe. But also with medical devices, there were two regulations, medical device regulation and the in vitro diagnostic device regulation, that harmonize the way clinical trials with medical devices are done in Europe. But as you see here in the right, there are other studies like non-interventional studies, there is a mistake here, it's not trial studies, or trials like the one that I was showing before that compares two procedures and is not drug involved. Those are still regulated at national level. So it's still complicated to follow up on all the national regulations when we want to go to the multinational component. In that sense, ECRIN has developed a tool called RED. It's the Regulatory and Ethical Database in which investigators can find per country what is the applicable legislation depending on the type of study that they want to set up. And then going to the problem of funding, I wanted to not just to show what are the problems, but also what are the opportunities. There are several programs in Europe funding research and research on rare diseases. On the left, we have the old programs. Maybe you are aware of some of them. The Horizon 2020 funded during several years in the past programs, research program for any rare diseases, including the eRare. It was a specific mechanism involving national funding from the different countries. And then the Innovation Medicine Initiative is public-private. So it's money from the European Commission and pharmaceutical companies. All these programs have been transformed, and now they have been transforming. What I list here is that now Horizon Europe is the program that is funding clinical research on everything, including in rare diseases in Europe. ERDERA is this partnership in which now Estonia is involved, so probably also opportunities for Estonia to work on rare diseases, and also the IHI initiative that is as I said, together commission with pharmaceutical companies. And just to want to announce that Herdera, this project, is going to focus mostly on launching calls for funding preclinical research, so no much clinical studies, but at least one call for clinical trials will be launched through the program. So if there is any investigator or even patients that are interested in looking for funding for research, this is an opportunity. And these are some of the projects that have been funded in the last call from the Commission in 2022 that was very specific for rare diseases and the development of effective therapies for rare diseases. All this information is available through the European Commission website. And then very important also to go to what I said before, the methodology that is now, has been developed so far for clinical trials was not very well adapted to the rare disease population. So the Commission also in the past have funded 3 projects, the ones that are listed on the left, through the Framework Program 7, that were working specifically in developing methodology for small populations. These were statistician methodologies that were leading the projects IDEAL, ASTERIC, and INSPIRE, that were specific projects to develop methodology for small populations. Now, just last year, 2 projects were funded. I'm missing another one that I mentioned before, INVENTS, and this other one called REAL-ISD, that again are funded specifically to develop methodology for rare diseases and ultra-rare diseases. And then if we go to the problem of patient recruitment, we said there are very few patients. Sometimes they are not easy to identify patients to recruit for clinical trials. In that sense, I think that these European reference networks that I mentioned before might help in different ways. The initial idea behind the creation of these European reference networks was facilitating interchange of information between clinicians for healthcare. So it was not very much oriented to the research, it was mostly for healthcare, on the rationale that expertise might be in a country and not in another one. So by facilitating interchange of information between clinicians in different countries through these ERNs, that might benefit getting a early diagnostic for patients and also the treatment. So it was born mostly on healthcare, but they also have the ambition to be involved in research and innovation. And in that sense, they have been together funded through 2 different projects, the ERICA project more oriented to research, and the Jardin project, in which I think is also Estonia is involved, that is more related to develop the capacity of the ERNs to work more oriented to the healthcare. I have to say also that in that sense, for interchanging information related to healthcare, the European Health Data Space is a new regulation in Europe, is supposed also to bring now the opportunity that the medical records are shared between different countries. So it's something that eventually should happen also not only for rare diseases patients, but for any patient in Europe. And some of these ERNs, I put 2 examples here, the ERN R&D and this other one, NMD, they both have created registries of patients. So I think that this can facilitate also that any investigator that is interested in finding a specific patient for a clinical trials find the patient through these registries. They have been developed with standards that were also developed by the European Commission and might be a way to fill out the gap on how to find patients for a clinical trial. And then related to the challenge that I mentioned before about patient-reported outcomes, something that is meaningful for the patient, this ERICA project has developed the PROMPTS repository. This is a repository of patient-reported outcome measures that might be used for investigators to design a clinical trial. And then just to finalize my presentation, I would like to go through this initiative. This is something that was started like 1 year ago. It involves both industry and academia. So FPI is the European Association of Pharma Industry in Europe. This initiative was initiated to discuss with different stakeholders how to make cross-border access to clinical trials possible. they met first just to identify what are the challenges. What you can see here is that they said, I think it's nice to have now this reflection after listening the parents of the children that have been that we have listened this morning in the different videos that are also here present, that it says only patients and caregivers with the education, language capabilities and financial means have access. It goes in line with what you have explained this morning. Also, identifying hospitals and investigators is challenging. Hospitals cite the lack of capacity to accommodate patients from other countries. They say also, and I think this is probably the most important one, the fact that insurance companies cite the lack of regulation as a main reason not to support cross-border participation. This is, I think, the main reason. It's not so easy to bring a patient to another country because sometimes in clinical trials, all the clinical trials have to be covered by law by an insurance. But in some cases, they are part of the gamut of the intervention that is covered by the healthcare system. In other cases, it's the trial. When the trial is not in the same site, it has to go to another country. The sponsor has to ensure that the patient is equally covered in another country, and this is what makes difficult also to put the patient in a different country, etc. And also, getting medical data across borders is a challenge, particularly once back in the country. This was another thing that they were. The patient is treated in the country, in a different country, and then goes back to their home country and has to be followed up in their own country. So interchange of medical records in different languages is also a challenge. Here, it's more or less related with what I said before, but this is also a gap analysis that they made within the same project, and they say, actually, cross-border trials are not explicitly forbidden in any country. This is something that they went to the conclusion there is no regulation in Europe that says patients cannot be treated in another country. This is possible, but they say the lack of clarity on the specific legal and regulatory guidance leads to cautious approach to cross-border participation for everyone, for the sponsor, for the investigator, and also for the patients. And also, what I said here is cross-border access is currently managed on a case-by-case basis and associated with a high logistical burden. So this is a reality, it's costly. So if it's a commercial sponsored trial, it has to be the pharmaceutical company who pays for everything and also who takes the risk if anything happens, if the insurance taken was not enough, etc. And honestly, for academic trials, they are always underfunded. It's very difficult. Anytime we get money to make a clinical trial in academia, it goes completely to the limit. So it's probably very difficult even also for academic trials to get cross-border access. And then, as I said, I think the main problem is actually who pays for what. It's the most critical issue because access to insurance coverage is needed. And then language barriers might impact the patient's ability to understand the risk. And this is something that we have heard also this morning from the mom of one of the children. And just, I wanted to tell you that this project has now released recommendations for cross-border access to clinical trials. This is a document that is now open for public consultation. Public consultation means public to anybody. So any of you, if you want to go to the website, read what are the recommendations, and you can make suggestions. And suggestions should be taken in consideration by the consortium to refine the recommendations. And so if there is any idea you have that should be changed, usually this is taken in consideration, so I invite it's supposed to be closed on the 10th of March, but I spoke like 2 days ago with somebody that is working in the project, and he said probably it's going to be longer. So there is the opportunity to everyone to make comments on these recommendations. And with that, I would like to thank you all for listening to me, and especially to Professor Unap for inviting me. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much, Marta.